All the Abrahamic religions believe in a transcendent deity who sets the rule of human conduct. In both Christianity and Islam, which has been my special interest over the years, virtue is rewarded with eternal life in heaven, while sin or wickedness is condemned to hell. However, there are very significant differences in the determination of virtue and sin. A key variable, I feel, has been insufficiently emphasized in the ecumenical discourses that talk about all of us worshipping the same God. And that key variable is the status of religious professionals and their role in the appropriation of transcendence. In Christianity, it was the church, and not the holy text, as in Islam, that originally called the shots, establishing rules of correct behavior and morality. A doctrine that endured even after the Reformation is extra ecclesiam nulla salus, no salvation outside the church, an inspiration to evangelicals who seek to save the unsaved, whether pagans or lapsed believers. It guaranteed the church's monopoly on granting access to eternity. The abuses of this monopoly, such as the sale of indulgences, etc., are well known, leading, of course, to the Protestant Reformation or the Protestant and the replacement of the false Church of Rome by the true churches of Protestant reformers. But it didn't actually change the doctrine of ecclesial absolutism. Although Martin Luther talked of the priesthood of all believers, he reaffirmed ecclesial absolutism, declaring that outside of the church there is no truth, no Christ, no salvation. In what might be called classical Christianity, including Lutheranism and the compromise cults like Anglicanism, which my forebears belonged to, salvation is not just conferred by belief, but by belonging to the church, the mystical body of Christ, i.e., membership of a spiritual body with its internal hierarchy, privileged status, and monopoly in the performance of rituals that ensure salvation in the afterlife. I became really interested in this when I was studying Islam because there was a sort of a priori assumption that Islam is just another version of Abrahamic religion. But in fact, the structures that flow from different organizational ways of promoting the faith are absolutely critical in my understanding. Islam, like Judaism, presents a significantly different model. There's no formal priesthood, but rather a community of believers, the ummah, that is supposed to live by rules passed down from the Prophet Muhammad that crystallized into the sharia, the divine law of Islam. In that respect, it has affinities with some of the Protestant sects, such as baptism, that emerged after the Reformation. The ʿulamaʻ, the learned men, issue guidance and the law. They tell you what the law is. They issue fatwas on particular issues and so forth. And the qadis, the judges appointed by Muslim rulers, enact the law through the sharia courts. Unlike in Christianity, which has highly ritualized formal systems of ordination and consecration for priests and bishops, religious authority is conferred by a system of personal transmission, traced back to Muhammad and his righteous companions through what might be called master-pupil lineages. The process originated with the classification of oral reports of the Prophet's sayings and deeds, known as hadiths or traditions, with the integrity of reports' authenticity guaranteed by a chain, Isnād is the Arabic word, of reliable transmitters, which is given as much emphasis as the actual content of the teaching. The form is as important as the structure itself. And Isnād is like a provenance of a valuable painting. If you're lucky enough to own a Van Gogh or something, you couldn't actually sell it unless you provided it with an authentic provenance of the chain of owners going back to the artist himself. So the Isnād is, I've often translated the word as actually provenance. In the course of time, this paradigm of personal rather than institutional certification applied to virtually every field of learning, as well as to guilds, crafts, and the mystical Sufi orders that dominated the pre-modern Islamic world. And this discourse actually became known as the ʿilm rijāl. It means the science of men, although the system was certainly patriarchal under modern feminist activists in Europe, for example, it can be seen as more inclusive and not just male-dominated. One of the outcomes of the system is a certain sort of social conformity, whereby the doctrine of ijmāʿ, which means really consensus of the learned, and then can become more popular in terms of consensus of the people, emerges as the a priori for good behavior. And of course you then get arguments about sexual behavior, food, what foods you can eat, what you can't, and so forth. Although it's very interesting, a very brilliant scholar who died at a sadly young age of, I think, 48, he was at Harvard, Shahab Ahmed, did a massive amount of work recently, and he actually found that Muslims throughout the Islamic world were boozing much more than their modern descendants would acknowledge. And even before prayer, in the afternoon prayer, they'd have a good glass of wine. And of course, we all drink Shiraz, which comes from Persia as well. So there are implications of that in the modern Muslim world. If you look at the problem is you don't seem to have clear structures of what determines good behavior and bad behavior in terms of Islamic law. And it's very interesting that one of the most influential of the Islamists who dominated the sort of intellectual discourse, he died in the 1960s, Abul A'la Maududi, a sort of Pakistani theoretician. He comes to the conclusion that in terms of the ʿilm and rijāl, in terms of the science of men of good behavior, you can't really have a democracy where people put themselves forward, because that in itself would be seen as a sign of pride if you put yourself forward to be elected. So he said that it should work much more like a jury system of sort of anonymous plucking of people, and that way, provided those people have good social reputations, you then produce the good Islamic nirvana, which some of his followers still look for. One of my interests in pursuing this line of inquiry has actually been to challenge Max Weber's, or it's not perhaps Max Weber himself, but it's the popular assumption that comes out of Weberian discourse that the capitalist revolution of early modernity actually emerged out of a change in ethics, the so-called Protestant ethic, whereas in fact my research, such as it is, has, I think, helped me understand that a crucial variable, in fact, has been the way in which the structures of the medieval church were highly nuanced, but they had one very particular characteristic, was that they had a formal separation between the church as an institution and the lay public as ordinary individuals or citizens. And my thesis, which has been reproduced in one or two of my books, and I plan to do more with it later, is essentially that whereas in many parts of the Muslim world today, even now, with 2 centuries of modernity and of post-colonialism and so forth, institutional authority of the state is subordinated to tribal or dynastic power, whereas Christianity, by contrast, and I'm talking of medieval Christianity, pre-Reformation Christianity, built on Roman models of the public sphere to construct systems of governance internal to the church organization to some degree that resisted tribal dynamics, creating corporate structures that facilitate both state construction and ultimately the accumulation of capital. I got interested in this because the big question when I was first sort of coming to the study of Islam in the early 1980s was, how was it that a civilization that was so developed around about 1500, 1600 in comparison with quote-unquote the West, didn't develop a capitalist revolution or a scientific revolution. And you could, of course, argue that some of it was to do with Islamic inheritance law. When the wealthy merchant died, he was required by the sharia law to distribute his wealth in proportions to his agnatic kin, to the male heirs, going down to often quite distant cousins and so forth. But I thought, the more I thought about it, because people doing Islam don't usually study Christianity at the same time. And what I came up with was a conclusion that actually the crucial variable was the fact that it wasn't Weber's Protestant ethic that generated the capitalist revolution, so much as the fact that the church structure of autonomous authority was secularized. So if you go, for instance, I haven't got the pictures to show it, but if you go to Holland and you see those wonderful Rembrandt pictures of the fathers of the corporations, the companies that were the sources of wealth, or even the great sort of iconic picture of the Night Watch, what you have is a celebration of the corporate militia, which is something which was alien to the Islamic discourse and the Islamic legal thing. There is no formally demarcated public sphere in the Islamic, traditional Islamic discourse. And of course, nowadays, with capitalism rampant in, say, the Gulf states and everywhere else, what you have is a very complex game whereby you have the formal production of wealth through corporate bodies. But in 9 cases out of 10, those corporate bodies are actually under the control of the tribal families, because Muhammad's utopian vision in the end went with the flow of tribalism, whereas what you find the Catholic Church's great contribution in European history in a kind of a way, if you can see it as a contribution, there may be nuances about that.
We're running out of time.
Okay, was that actually the corporations, the corporate structures which enable people to transcend individual mortality, which is the absolute key here. The group lost, the brand lost. I used to give a lecture in the States trying to get the students to wake up and forget their mobile phones. I said, what you've got to realize that Jesus Christ was the first president of General Motors. And I think here in Sweden we could say, well, maybe also IKEA and Volvo. But the corporate structures which transcend individual mortality are the keys to the accumulation of capital. And that is the contribution I've been trying to make in both this seminar and also in other works I've been engaged with. Thank you.
Thank you, Malise. Malise, these organizational differences between the Christian churches, how does this affect the idea of virtue then?
Well, I think that virtue tends to be built in the Islamic world of the concept of virtue, and of course it's very difficult to make universal generalizations. But the idea of ijmāʿ, which is consensus of the community, is critical, and that tends to elevate, you could say, social conformity over individual morality to some degree. If you look at individual cases, of course, it gets rather complicated. You do have heroes who challenge the system, particularly in the colonial era, when, of course, the system, the ʿulamaʻ, the religious establishment tended to succumb to the blandishments of colonial authority and colonial power. And you had individuals who stood up against this, and they become, like Abdul Karim in Algeria and Tunisia, they become national heroes and seen as the saviors of the nation. But I think part of the problem there was that colonialism introduced modern practices, obviously, in the interests of the colonial power, but also to some extent in the interests of issues like public health and things like that. And very often the ijmāʿ, the consensus of the community, went against that. So you had a lot of leaders who used the social conformity, which is very strongly entrenched in the Islamic tradition, to resist. You've even seen that in recent years in Afghanistan, where programs for giving people jabs were resisted by local community leaders, because you haven't got a church which can put itself in advance of public opinion.
The little I know of the Quran, to me it seems like a handbook in attaining virtue. It's about your relation to Allah, and it's about your behavior in society. Am I right?
Yes, it is very individualistic, and because it's individualistic, you haven't got a corporate structure which actually determines what the good should be. And I think in consequence you have that sort of momentum of what we might see as sort of populist morality, and of the terrific parallels, of course, between evangelical Protestantism as you find it in the US at the present time, where it's, almost anyone can become a preacher, going back to the 19th century and so forth, and the kind of populist momentum that you find in Islamic countries at this time.
Great having you here. Thank you.